The forest was quiet, except for the sound of the river rushing over the rocks. Jake, a wildlife photographer, adjusted his camera and scanned the area. He'd been tracking a bear for days, hoping to capture the perfect shot. But today, something felt off. The air was tense, and the usual chirping of birds was absent. As he walked closer to the riverbank, he heard a loud splash. His heart raced. Was it the bear? He crouched behind a bush and peeked through his camera lens. What he saw made his stomach drop. A massive brown bear was struggling in the fast-moving river. Its paws flailed wildly, but the current was too strong. The bear let out a panicked roar as it fought to stay afloat. Jake froze. He'd never been this close to a bear before, and every instinct told him to run. But the bear's desperate cries tugged at something deep inside him. "I can't just stand here," Jake muttered to himself. He dropped his camera bag and scanned the area for anything that could help. A fallen tree branch lay nearby. Without thinking, he grabbed it and ran toward the river. The bear's eyes locked onto Jake as he approached. For a moment, Jake hesitated. What if the bear attacked him? But the fear in the animal's eyes was unmistakable. It wasn't a predator right now. It was a creature fighting for its life. "Hold on, buddy!" Jake shouted, stretching the branch toward the bear. The current was pulling the bear further away, and Jake knew he had only seconds to act. He stepped into the icy water, ignoring the cold biting his legs. The bear reached for the branch, its claws scraping against the bark. Jake held on tightly, his muscles straining as he pulled with all his strength. The bear's weight was overwhelming, and for a moment Jake thought he'd lose his grip. But then, with one final heave, the bear managed to grab hold of the riverbank. Jake stumbled back, gasping for breath. The bear lay on the ground, its fur dripping wet, its chest heaving. Jake's heart pounded as he stared at the animal. What now? Would it attack him? Or would it simply walk away? The bear lifted its head and looked at Jake. There was no aggression in its eyes, just exhaustion and something else. Gratitude? Jake couldn't be sure. Before he could process what had just happened, the bear slowly stood up, shook the water off its fur, and disappeared into the trees. Jake sat there, soaked and shivering, his mind racing. He'd just risked his life to save a bear. And for what? A story to tell? A photo he didn't even take? He didn't have answers. But one thing was clear. This wasn't the end. Jake sat by the riverbank for what felt like hours, his clothes still damp, and his mind replaying the encounter. The forest was eerily quiet, as if holding its breath. He glanced at his camera bag, lying forgotten on the ground. Part of him regretted not capturing the moment, but another part knew some things were meant to be experienced, not photographed. As he stood up, a low growl echoed through the trees. Jake froze. His eyes darted around, searching for the source. The growl came again, closer this time. His heart raced. Was it the bear, or something else? Before he could decide what to do, a rustling sound came from the bushes nearby. Jake's hand instinctively reached for the branch he'd used earlier, gripping it tightly. The rustling grew louder, and then a small figure emerged. It was a bear cub. The cub looked no older than a few months, its fur a lighter shade of brown, and its eyes wide with curiosity. It tilted its head, staring at Jake as if trying to figure out what he was. Jake let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. "Hey there, little guy," Jake said softly, lowering the branch. "Where's your mom?" The cub took a cautious step forward, sniffing the air. Jake crouched down, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. He knew better than to approach a wild animal, but the cub seemed more curious than afraid. "You lost?" Jake asked, his voice gentle. The cub let out a soft whine, as if answering him. Jake's mind raced. If the cub was alone, it was in danger. Predators, starvation, or even the river could take its life. But helping a bear cub wasn't as simple as saving an adult bear. Where was its mother, and why had it wandered off? As if on cue, a loud roar shattered the silence. Jake's head snapped up and his blood ran cold. The mother bear, the same one he'd saved, was standing at the edge of the clearing, her eyes locked on him. Jake slowly straightened up, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Easy now," he said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "I'm not here to hurt your baby." The mother bear growled, a deep rumbling sound that made the ground seem to vibrate. She took a step forward, her massive frame casting a she attack him, or would she remember what he'd done for her? The bear stopped a few feet away, her gaze shifting between Jake and her cub. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, to Jake's astonishment, the bear let out a soft huff and turned away, nudging her cub toward the trees. Jake exhaled sharply, his legs trembling with relief. He watched as the two bears disappeared into the forest, the cub glancing back at him once before vanishing into the shadows. "Well, that's something you don't see every day," Jake muttered to himself, running a hand through his hair. But his relief was short-lived. As he turned to leave, he noticed something on the ground near where the cub had been standing. It was a small, torn piece of fabric, dirty and frayed. Jake picked it up, frowning. It looked like it had come from a piece of clothing. His stomach churned. Was someone else out here? And if so, why had they left this behind? Jake's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of voices in the distance. He froze, listening intently. The voices were faint, but they were definitely human, and they were coming closer. Jake's instincts kicked in. He grabbed his camera bag and ducked behind a tree, his heart pounding. Who were these people? And what were they doing in the middle of the forest? The voices grew louder, and soon 2 men came into view. They were dressed in rugged clothing, carrying backpacks and what looked like hunting rifles. Jake's blood ran cold. Poachers. "I told you I saw a bear around here," one of the men said, his voice gruff. "A big one. And where there's a big bear, there's usually cubs." The other man chuckled. "Cubs fetch a good price. Let's find them before it gets dark." Jake's fists clenched. He knew he had to do something, but what? He was outnumbered and unarmed. Confronting them directly would be suicide. As the men moved deeper into the forest, Jake made a decision. He couldn't let them harm the bears, not after everything he'd been through. He quietly followed them, keeping a safe distance and using the trees for cover. The men stopped near a cluster of rocks, discussing their plan. Jake's mind raced. He needed a way to distract them, to buy himself some time. Then an idea struck him. He reached into his camera bag and pulled out a small, shiny object, a lens cap. He aimed carefully and threw it as far as he could. It landed with a loud clatter, echoing through the trees. The men spun around, their rifles raised. "What was that?" one of them hissed. "Probably just an animal," the other replied, though he didn't sound convinced. Jake held his breath, hoping his plan would work. The men hesitated, then decided to investigate the noise, moving away from the rocks. Jake seized the opportunity. He crept forward, his eyes scanning the area, and then he saw it, a small, hidden cave behind the rocks. Inside, the mother bear and her cub were huddled together, their eyes wide with fear. Jake's heart ached. He had to protect them. But how? Jake crouched behind the rocks, his mind racing. The poachers were still nearby, their voices growing louder as they searched for the source of the noise. He glanced at the cave where the mother bear and her cub were hiding. The mother bear's eyes met his, and for a moment Jake felt a strange connection. It was as if she understood he was trying to help. But helping wasn't going to be easy. The poachers were armed, and Jake was just one man with a camera bag. He needed a plan, and fast. The voices of the men grew closer. "I swear I heard something over here," one of them said, his tone impatient. "Let's check those rocks." Jake's heart pounded. He couldn't let them find the bears. He looked around, searching for anything he could use to create a distraction. His eyes landed on a loose rock nearby. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. He picked up the rock and hurled it as far as he could. It landed with a loud thud, causing the men to stop in their tracks. "What the—" one of them started, but before he could finish, a loud, rustling sound came from the direction of the rock. The men turned, their rifles raised, and began moving toward the noise. Jake seized the moment. He crept out from behind the rocks and made his way to the cave. The mother bear growled softly, her protective instincts kicking in, but Jake held up his hands in a calming gesture. "It's okay," he whispered. "I'm not here to hurt you, but you need to get out of here. Those men are dangerous." The bear stared at him, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and understanding. Jake knew he couldn't explain the situation to her, but he hoped she could sense his intentions. The cub, curious as ever, poked its head out from behind its mother. Jake reached into his camera bag and pulled out a protein bar he'd packed for emergencies. He unwrapped it and held it out, hoping the scent would lure the cub closer. "Come on, little guy," Jake said softly. "We need to move." The cub sniffed the air and took a hesitant step forward. Its mother let out a low growl, but Jake stayed still, letting the cub come to him. When the cub was close enough, Jake gently scooped it up, holding it securely but carefully. The mother bear growled again, louder this time, but Jake didn't back down. "I'm trying to help," he said, his voice firm. "If we stay here, we're all in danger." The bear seemed to hesitate, her eyes flicking between Jake and the cub. Then, with a reluctant huff, she stepped out of the cave, her massive frame towering over Jake. Jake's heart raced, but he forced himself to stay calm. He knew the bear could easily overpower him, but he also knew she was more concerned about her cub than anything else. "Let's go," Jake said, gesturing for the bear to follow him. He moved quickly but quietly, keeping the cub close to his chest. The mother bear followed, her eyes scanning the area for any sign of danger. Jake led them deeper into the forest, away from the poachers, and toward a safer area he'd scouted earlier. As they moved, Jake's mind raced with questions. How long could he keep this up? What would happen when the poachers realized the bears were gone? And most importantly, how was he going to get out of this alive? The forest grew denser, the trees closing in around them. Jake could hear the distant voices of the poachers, but they were fading now. He allowed himself a small sigh of relief, but he knew they weren't out of the woods yet, literally. The cub squirmed in his arms, letting out a soft whine. Jake stopped and set the cub down, letting it stretch its legs. The mother bear immediately nuzzled her cub, checking it over for any signs of harm. Jake watched them, a strange sense of pride swelling in his chest. He'd done it. He'd saved them, at least for now. But his relief was short-lived. A loud crack echoed through the forest, followed by the sound of footsteps. Jake's heart sank. The poachers had found them. "Over here!" one of the men shouted. "I see them!" Jake's mind raced. He couldn't outrun them, and he couldn't fight them, but he couldn't let them take the bears either. The mother bear let out a fierce roar, her protective instincts kicking in. She stepped in front of Jake and the cub, her massive frame a barrier between them and the approaching men. Jake knew this was his chance. He grabbed the cub and ran, his legs burning with the effort. The mother bear stayed behind, her roars echoing through the forest as she confronted the poachers. Jake didn't look back. He couldn't. He focused on putting as much distance between himself and the danger as possible. The cub clung to him, its tiny claws digging into his shirt, but Jake didn't care. All that mattered was keeping it safe. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jake reached a small clearing. He set the cub down and collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath. His body ached, and his mind was a whirlwind of emotions. But he'd done it. He'd saved the cub. But what about the mother bear? Jake's heart ached at the thought. He didn't know if she'd survived the encounter with the poachers, but he hoped with all his might that she had. The cub let out a soft whine, snapping Jake out of his thoughts. He looked down at the little bear, its eyes wide and trusting. "Don't worry," Jake said softly, stroking the cub's fur. "I'll take care of you, no matter what." But as he sat there catching his breath, Jake knew this wasn't over. The poachers were still out there, and they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. And Jake wasn't going to let that happen. The forest was eerily quiet now, the only sound the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. Jake sat in the clearing, the bear cub curled up beside him. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, but one thing was clear: he couldn't stay here. The poachers were still out there, and they wouldn't stop until they found the cub. Jake glanced down at the little bear. It looked up at him with trusting eyes, completely unaware of the danger it was in. Jake's heart ached. He couldn't let anything happen to this innocent creature. "All right, little guy," Jake said softly, standing up. "We need to keep moving." The cub let out a soft whine, but followed Jake as he started walking. Jake didn't have a clear plan, but he knew he needed to get as far away from the poachers as possible. He also needed to find a safe place for the cub, somewhere the poachers wouldn't think to look. As they walked, Jake kept his ears open for any signs of the poachers. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made him tense, but so far there was no sign of them. He hoped the mother bear had managed to scare them off, but he couldn't be sure. After about an hour of walking, Jake came across a small cave hidden behind a cluster of bushes. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do for now. He crouched down and peered inside. The cave was shallow but big enough to provide some shelter. "This'll have to do," Jake muttered to himself. He turned to the cub, who was sniffing the ground curiously. "Come on, little guy. Let's get you settled." The cub followed Jake into the cave, its nose twitching as it explored the new surroundings. Jake sat down, leaning against the cave wall, and let out a long breath. He was exhausted, both physically and mentally, but he knew he couldn't rest for long. The cub curled up beside him, its warmth a small comfort in the cold cave. Jake reached into his camera bag and pulled out the last of his protein bars. He broke it in half and offered a piece to the cub, who eagerly snatched it up. "You're a hungry little thing, aren't you?" Jake said with a small smile. As the cub ate, Jake's mind wandered. He thought about the mother bear and what might have happened to her. He hoped she was okay, but he couldn't shake the feeling of guilt. He'd taken her cub, and now she was out there alone, possibly injured or worse. Jake shook his head, trying to push the thoughts away. He needed to focus on the present. He needed to keep the cub safe. But how? Jake didn't have any experience with bears, let alone raising a cub. He knew he couldn't keep it with him forever, but he also couldn't just leave it in the wild. It was too young to survive on its own. As he sat there trying to come up with a plan, a noise outside the cave made him freeze. It was faint but unmistakable, the sound of footsteps. Jake's heart raced. He held his breath, listening intently. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the sound of voices. "I swear I saw something over here," one of the poachers said, his voice gruff. "You've been saying that for hours," the other replied, sounding annoyed. "If we don't find that cub soon, we're wasting our time." Jake's stomach churned. They were close, too close. He glanced at the cub, who was now asleep beside him. He couldn't let them find it. Quietly, Jake stood up and peeked out of the cave. The poachers were about 50 feet away, their rifles slung over their shoulders. They were scanning the area, their eyes sharp and focused. Jake's mind raced. He needed a distraction, something to draw them away from the cave. He looked around, searching for anything he could use. His eyes landed on a large rock a few feet away. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Jake crept out of the cave, keeping low to the ground. He grabbed the rock and hurled it as far as he could. It landed with a loud thud, causing the poachers to spin around. "What was that?" one of them hissed. "Probably just an animal," the other replied, though he didn't sound convinced. The men hesitated, then decided to investigate the noise moving away from the cave. Jake let out a small sigh of relief, but he knew it was only a temporary solution. He needed a better plan. As he crouched there trying to think, an idea struck him. He remembered seeing a ranger station on the map a few miles back. If he could get there, he could get help, but getting there wouldn't be easy. The poachers were still out there, and he had a bear cub to protect. Jake glanced back at the cave. The cub was still asleep, completely unaware of the danger. Jake knew he couldn't carry it all the way to the ranger station, but he also couldn't leave it behind. He needed to find a way to keep the cub safe while he went for help. As he sat there, trying to come up with a solution, the cub stirred, letting out a soft whine. Jake's heart ached. He couldn't let anything happen to this little bear. "Don't worry," Jake whispered, stroking the cub's fur. "I'll figure something out, I promise." But deep down, he knew the odds were against him. The poachers were relentless, and time was running out. Jake took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. He didn't know how this would end, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to give up. Not now. Not ever. Jake sat in the cave, his mind racing. The cub was still asleep, its tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. Outside, the forest was quiet, but Jake knew the poachers were still out there, searching for them. He couldn't stay here forever. He needed to act, and fast. The idea of heading to the ranger station was his best bet, but it was miles away, and he couldn't risk carrying the cub through the forest. The poachers were too close, and the cub would slow him down. He needed a way to keep the cub safe while he went for help. Jake glanced around the cave, searching for anything that could help. His eyes landed on a small crevice in the back wall, just big enough to hide the cub. It wasn't perfect, but it would have to do. "All right, little guy," Jake whispered, gently picking up the cub. "I need you to stay here for a while, just until I come back, okay?" The cub let out a soft whine, its eyes blinking sleepily. Jake's heart ached, but he knew this was the only way. He carefully placed the cub in the crevice, making sure it was hidden from view. "Stay quiet," Jake said, stroking the cub's fur one last time. "I'll be back soon." The cub curled up, its eyes closing as it drifted back to sleep. Jake took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. He grabbed his camera bag and crept out of the cave, keeping low to the ground. The forest was eerily quiet, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the wind. Jake moved quickly but quietly, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of the poachers. He knew they were close, and one wrong move could mean the end for him and the cub. As he walked, Jake's mind raced with questions. What if the poachers found the cub while he was gone? What if he couldn't make it to the ranger station in time? He pushed the thoughts aside, focusing on the task at hand. He couldn't afford to second-guess himself now. After about 20 minutes of walking, Jake heard voices in the distance. He froze, his heart pounding. The poachers were still out there, and they were getting closer. Jake crouched behind a tree, peeking out cautiously. The two men were about 50 feet away, their rifles slung over their shoulders. They were arguing, their voices sharp and angry. "I told you we should have gone the other way," one of them snapped. "Now we've lost the trail." "We'll find it," the other replied, his tone cold. "That cub's worth a lot of money. We're not leaving without it." Jake's stomach churned. He needed to get past them, but how? He couldn't risk being seen. As he sat there, trying to come up with a plan, a loud roar echoed through the forest. Jake's head snapped up, and his blood ran cold. It was the mother bear. The poachers heard it too. They spun around, their rifles raised, their eyes scanning the trees. "That's the big one of them said, a hint of fear in his voice. "We need to take it down before it finds us." Jake's heart raced. He couldn't let them hurt the mother bear. But what could he do? He was unarmed and outnumbered. Before he could decide, the mother bear burst into the clearing, her massive frame towering over the poachers. She let out another roar, her eyes blazing with fury. The poachers didn't hesitate. They raised their rifles and fired, the sound of gunshots echoing through the forest. Jake's heart sank as the mother bear stumbled, a pained growl escaping her throat. But she didn't go down. Instead, she charged at the poachers, her claws slashing through the air. The men scrambled to reload their rifles, their faces pale with fear. Jake knew this was his chance. While the poachers were distracted, he could make a run for it. But he couldn't just leave the mother bear to fight alone. He grabbed a large rock from the ground and hurled it at one of the poachers, hitting him square in the back. The man let out a cry of pain, dropping his rifle as he fell to the ground. The other poacher spun around, his eyes wide with shock. "What the—" But before he could finish, the mother bear was on him, her massive paws knocking the rifle from his hands. The man screamed, scrambling to get away, but the bear was too fast. Jake didn't stick around to see what happened next. He turned and ran, his legs burning with the effort. He didn't know if the mother bear would survive, but he couldn't waste the opportunity she'd given him. As he ran, Jake's mind raced. He needed to get to the ranger station as fast as possible. He needed to get help. The forest blurred around him as he pushed himself to go faster. His lungs burned, and his legs felt like they were about to give out. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jake burst into a clearing. In the distance, he could see the ranger station, its lights shining like a beacon of hope. Jake's heart soared. He was almost there. But as he ran toward the station, a loud roar echoed through the forest behind him. Jake froze, his blood running cold. The mother bear. He turned around, his eyes scanning the trees. And then he saw her, the mother bear, limping but alive, her eyes locked on him. Jake's heart ached. She'd fought off the poachers, but she was injured, and she was here for him. The bear let out a soft huff, her eyes filled with something Jake couldn't quite place. Gratitude. Trust. Jake didn't have time to think. He turned and ran toward the ranger station, the mother bear following close behind. Jake sprinted toward the ranger station, his legs burning and his breath coming in ragged gasps. The mother bear followed close behind, her heavy footsteps echoing through the forest. Despite her injuries, she kept pace with Jake, her determination unwavering. As they neared the station, Jake could see movement inside. A ranger stepped out onto the porch, his eyes widening as he spotted Jake and the massive bear charging toward him. "Hey, over here!" Jake shouted, waving his arms frantically. "We need help!" The ranger didn't hesitate. He grabbed his radio and called for backup, his voice urgent. Within minutes, several other rangers emerged from the station, their rifles raised but their expressions cautious. "Don't shoot!" Jake yelled, skidding to a stop in front of them. "She's not here to hurt anyone. She's protecting her cub." The rangers exchanged uneasy glances, but they lowered their weapons. The mother bear stopped a few feet away, her chest heaving and her eyes locked on Jake. She let out a soft huff as if to say, "I trust you." One of the rangers, an older man with a kind face, stepped forward. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Jake quickly explained everything, the poachers, the cub, and how the mother bear had fought to protect them. The rangers listened intently, their expressions growing more serious with each word. "We'll handle it from here," the older ranger said, nodding to his team. "You've done enough." Jake hesitated, glancing back at the mother bear. She was still watching him, her eyes filled with a mix of exhaustion and gratitude. "What about her?" Jake asked, his voice trembling. "She's hurt. She needs help." The ranger nodded. "We'll take care of her. We've got a wildlife vet on call. She'll be okay." Jake let out a long breath, his shoulders sagging with relief. He turned to the mother bear, his heart swelling with emotion. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "You saved us." The bear let out a low huff, her eyes softening. For a moment, it felt like she understood. Then, with a final glance at Jake, she turned and limped into the forest, disappearing among the trees. Jake watched her go, a lump forming in his throat. He didn't know if he'd ever see her again, but he knew one thing for sure. She was a fighter, and she'd do whatever it took to protect her cub. The rangers quickly mobilized, heading into the forest to track down the poachers. Jake stayed behind, his body and mind utterly exhausted. He sat on the porch of the ranger station, his head in his hands, trying to process everything that had happened. A few hours later, the rangers returned with the poachers in custody. The men looked defeated, their heads hanging low as they were led away. Jake felt a small sense of satisfaction, but it was overshadowed by the weight of the day's events. The older ranger approached Jake, a kind smile on his face. "You did a good thing today," he said, clapping Jake on the shoulder. "Not many people would have risked their life for a bear." Jake shrugged, his voice quiet. "I couldn't just stand by and do nothing." The ranger nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's what makes you different. You saw a living being in need, and you acted. That's rare these days." Jake didn't know what to say. He'd never thought of himself as a hero. He'd just done what felt right. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the forest, Jake felt a sense of peace settle over him. The cub was safe, the mother bear was being cared for, and the poachers were behind bars. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was a hopeful one. Before leaving, Jake took one last look at the forest. Somewhere out there, the mother bear and her cub were together, free to live their lives without fear, and Jake knew he'd played a small part in making that possible. Moral message for the audience. This story reminds us that every life has value, and every creature deserves a chance to live freely and safely. Jake's bravery and compassion show us that even in the face of danger, we can choose to do what's right. The bond between the mother bear and her cub teaches us about the power of love and sacrifice. No matter the species, the instinct to protect and care for one another is universal. And finally, the story highlights the importance of standing up against cruelty and injustice. Whether it's protecting wildlife or helping those in need, our actions, no matter how small, can make a difference. Let this story inspire you to be brave, to be kind, and to always fight for what's right. Because in the end, it's not just about saving a life. It's about preserving the beauty and balance of the world we all share.